Hello, and welcome to My Week in Baseball. I'm your host, Phil Estruth Harrison. You're listening to Season 2, Episode 4. All episodes are now available in both video and podcast format on our new website, myweekinbaseball.com. And a couple of special acknowledgments this week. First, to Rose Petal Studios for the artwork and logos created especially for this show and website. You'll find Rose Petal Studios on Instagram at rosepetal_studios. Second, thanks to Brunjo Productions in Nashville for our intro music. Learn more at brunjo.com. Today, we have a special treat for you, my friends, as I talk with Mark Lowenstein of GreatRuns.com about his experience as a fan of the Montreal Expos and a legendary season of Strat-O-Matic baseball. Of course, we'll also have a timely Blimerick, our baseball limerick of the day. So let's get right to it. So I'd like to welcome Mark to the show. Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Great to be with you.
Yeah. So I just like to start things off by asking a little bit about some of your favorites, your favorite team.
Favorite team in baseball?
Yes.
Well, right now it's the Red Sox. I've been living in Boston for 30 years. It wasn't my favorite team growing up, but since I've been in Boston this long, I do love the Red Sox. I go to a bunch of games every year and got very caught up, particularly in the era where they were clawing at the Yankees.
A great time to be a Red Sox fan. Yeah.
Yeah.
And earlier in your formative years, you had another team that was a favorite, I believe.
Yes, I grew up in Montreal, and those formative years where you really get the love of baseball. I grew up with the Montreal Expos. It was mainly in the 1970s and early 80s that I was growing up in Montreal, and the Expos as a franchise only started in 1969. In that first year, they actually went 52 and 110. I was 5 years old when they started in 1969, and they played for their first few years at a little rinky-dink ballpark called Jarry Park, which only had a capacity of 28,000.
Oh my!
And really, it would look like basically a minor league stadium, like the type they have for spring training in Florida. That's sort of how it looks. It's actually now gained new life as a major tennis center, and that's where a major tennis tournament occurs every summer.
So it's still there,
it's still there, but the site, the stadium, has been repurposed and is now a tennis stadium. And they have in the outlying area, they have a whole bunch of different courts. And then so the Expos played in Jarry Park for a number of years, and then I think the first year that they played in Olympic Stadium. I think from the 1977 season on, because the Olympics were held in Montreal in 1976.
Sure.
And that stadium was a terrible place to watch baseball. It was one of those classic 1970s era stadiums, most of which are no longer, that were big, concrete, AstroTurf, not good sight lines, multi-purpose.
Well, and it was built, as you said, for the Olympics. And at that time, baseball was not an Olympic sport, so was never designed for baseball.
Wasn't designed for baseball at all. And it was a multi-purpose stadium even after the Olympics. The Canadian football team, the Montreal Alouettes, used it as their stadium. It was used for soccer. It was used for a number of different things. And the stadium was sort of an interesting story that it was going to be it was built to be the first stadium ever with a retractable roof, and they never got it to work. So the stadium still exists today, and the roof is on it, but it's permanently on it.
Permanently in place.
And they never got the retractable roof to work. But that's where the Expos played from 1977 until their final year, which was 1994. But the good thing is it had a huge capacity like those multi-purpose stadiums. And so you could go as a kid, which I did many times. You could take the subway there. It was called the Metro. And you could go, the bleacher seats were $1.
Wow.
So you could just go with a bunch of pals to a game. It was never a financial consideration, how much it cost to go to a ball game. The financial consideration was how much you were going to spend on
On the
concessions,
hot dogs and yeah,
the
right.
concessions, and even back then didn't seem as wildly overpriced, I guess, as they are today. So I grew up with the Expos in the 70s, and they had up and down years. Although one interesting piece of, because this would sort of be very different today, in 1979, they won 95 games and they did not make the playoffs.
It was second. They finished second in the National League East,
second to
and
the
this is
Pittsburgh Pirates.
before the wild card. The wild card didn't start until the mid 1990s.
Right, right, and so they finished second to the Pittsburgh Pirates that year. And when we always, every team I think has people who are fans will say so and so is a Red Sox killer or a Dodgers killer or whoever, or Tigers killer. So the ultimate Expos killer in the 70s that I remember was Willie Stargell.
Oh, he was great those last years of the 70s. Yeah, he was.
Yeah. And then the following year was the year. So it was, in 1981 was the year that they made the playoffs for the only time in their history.
And one thing that's unique about that, because I was going back and looking at it, and I remembered that 81 was a strike year, but I didn't quite remember how it worked. So they ended up striking in the middle of the season.
Yes.
So they played a first half, which I believe Montreal came in third place, and then they played a second half. The Expos came in first place. Right. And the way they did it was that the winners of the two halves made the playoffs. It was something like that.
Yes, they had a playoff. It was sort of like the predecessor to the wild card idea. But so it was the Expos and the Phillies. They played a best of 5 series, which the Expos won 3-2. And so then that got them into the pennant, into the National League Championship Series, which they played against the Los Angeles Dodgers. And back then it was a best of 5 series. And it went to 5 games. And the 5th game was in Montreal. And that was delayed. So the 5th game was supposed to be on a Sunday on national television, and it was delayed. It was a cold, rainy day, so they delayed it to Monday. So they played it on a Monday afternoon. And I was lucky enough, I was able to get tickets. I took school off that day and went to the game. It was a very, very tight game. It was a pitcher's battle. Each team hit a home run, and it went to the 9th inning. And at the top of the 9th inning, the Expos brought in the pitcher who had been their ace pitcher that year. I think he might have won 20 games or came very close to, a guy named Steve Rogers, who was a longtime strong pitcher for the Expos, but he had a career year
him. Yeah.
that year. So they brought him in relief, which they'd never done before. I don't know if he'd ever pitched an inning of relief, but here you are, you're game 5 of the pennant. Mm-hmm. So he comes in and he gives up a home run in the top of the 9th to Rick Monday. So that day was, is always now known in Montreal as Blue Monday, because it was Rick Monday on a Monday.
On a Monday, Blue Monday.
On a cold, damp afternoon in Montreal, dashed the hopes. And it was a big thing for the Expos to make the playoffs. It was the only time ever. I remember I went to 2 games actually during those playoffs, and in the back wall, they had the large Canadian and American flags hanging off the back wall around the buntings and so on, the traditional buntings. But I remember those flags, and it was a big deal.
Yeah, the first Canadian team.
And then after they never made the playoffs again, although there was a year, I think it was in 1994, which was the other strike shortened season, which I think it was the only season that they didn't have a playoff.
That's exactly right. And this is what I was just looking up yesterday, just to kind of learn a little bit more about history of the Expos. Yeah, the only other year that they would have made the playoffs was in 1994. They finished first, but there were no playoffs because the strike happened later in the season and they canceled all the playoffs. No World Series.
And they had an incredible record that year. I think they were playing .650 ball.
Oh, wow. And Pedro Martinez I think it was maybe his first year with the Expos.
Yeah. And those years, like in the late 70s, early 80s, the season where they won 95 games and when they made the playoffs, those were the early years of Gary Carter and Tim Raines and Andre Dawson and Ellis Valentine.
Yeah.
And, those were great players. And back then, they were able to hold on to them for a while. And then, in the mid to late 80s, one of the reasons why they had trouble holding on to the players is because the Canadian dollar started to deteriorate significantly, its value against the US dollar. So it cost them so much more money, relatively speaking, to keep those players. So that was one of the factors that was
I wasn't aware of that. Oh
their
my.
inability to sign some of those players.
Yeah, so it's really like a currency exchange issue.
Yeah. And not a big market team, not quite, not the attendance of some of the other major cities. And that's, as as a lifelong baseball fan yourself, it was really in the mid to late 80s where money started to just become a bigger deal in the game. Up till then, it wasn't, I think there was a little more parity in the game.
I think that's true. Yeah. Both financially and the way teams approach drafting and evaluating
Yeah.
players. And then the money changed, and then the way teams evaluate players changed, and some teams embraced that and some teams did not, like my Tigers.
Yeah, but the Expos had one of the things they did have all those years, my recollection, is a fantastic farm system. I mean, they brought up some great players, Raines and Dawson and Carter all came up through the farm system. Pedro Martinez came up, Larry Walker, Andres Galarraga, if you remember him, he was a star.
I do. Okay, I remember him starring for Colorado, but I had forgotten he was on Montreal.
Got to start with the Expos. Vladimir Guerrero.
So that's got to be tough to have this crazy luck of these two strike years. Well, one year, I guess you'd say in 81, the strike helped because overall, Montreal would have finished in second based on their total record for the season. But because they broke it into two halves and they won the second half, it propelled you into the playoffs. But then in 94, to be in first place, to have a great record, to have all those good players and nothing, no playoffs, nothing.
Yeah. And it is hard to know how they would have done that year if they played the full year in 1981. The other sort of key memory I have of all those years, I think Montreal did, and this is back when the All-Star game was like a really big deal and everybody watched it. I think Montreal did host an All-Star game once. And that was sort of at the height of Gary Carter. He was a starter. So just to host the All-Star game, Gary Carter I think he might have hit a home run or did something great in that game. Is another sort of memory that stays with me.
And I'm just looking that up. Rhea would have been right in that era, 1982.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are great teams. And I remember Carter was always the best catcher in the National League. And at that period of time, Lance Parrish for the Tigers was the best catcher in the AL.
Yeah.
And they were head and shoulders above everybody else.
They were. And I think, I might be wrong, but I think that Gary Carter is the only player in the Hall of Fame with an Expos uniform. There are other great players who are in the Hall of Fame who played for several years with the Expos, like Pedro Martinez, but not with an Expos uniform.
Interesting. Wow. So I'm wondering, how did you feel about, or did it even matter to you that by that time when they moved to Washington and become the Washington Nationals, did that even feel like the same team anymore? Did it even matter?
It didn't. I mean, they did for a few years sort of become a little bit of my adopted National League team. By then had been in Boston for a number of years. I was sort of caught the Red Sox fever and was sort of a Sox fan. And there were a few players when the Nationals started who had been with the Expos, of course, who then were playing for the Nationals. So, it was for those first few years, of course, that I was rooting for the Nationals. They were sort of my adopted National League team. But then that sort of ebbed over the years as the number of players or people who had been affiliated with the Expos diminished.
Yeah. So eventually, I mean, I guess you could say eventually the Expos franchise wins the World Series with Max Scherzer and the Washington Nationals.
They do.
It's a little bit.
By then, I don't know that there was anybody who really was affiliated with the Expos.
Probably not. So Okay, well, that's great. Great, interesting background. A couple other things I looked up. Pedro Martinez was originally signed by the Dodgers, and he got traded to Montreal for Delino DeShields. And I remember
Oh,
thinking,
really?
I remember Delino DeShields.
Yeah,
So I looked him up, and he was pretty good. I think he had some injuries that prevented him from being as good as expected.
it's
So,
true. I think he was I think he was fast. I think he stole a lot of bases,
mhm,
if I remember
yeah.
correctly, which was also one of the Tim Raines in his prime was a big base stealer at a time
Oh,
when there were more stolen bases in the game.
Tim Raines was amazing. Yeah, he stole, I don't know if he stole 100. He's still close. He was in the
Yeah.
90s anyway, one year. And then eventually Montreal ends up trading Martinez to the Red Sox for Carl Pavano and a player to be named later who turns out to be Tony Armas.
Yeah, and I don't think either of them stayed with the Expos for long.
It's
Yeah,
probably right at
not a good trade.
no, and I think probably right. Tony Armas had been quite a good player, but I think that's right. I believe right at the end of his career there.
Yeah, didn't Tony Armas, didn't he play for Oakland?
He did play for Oakland at some point. Yeah. So we talked about the Expos. So going as a youngster, going and sitting in the $1 seats in the outfield, I like that. So what's the first game that you remember either watching on TV or going to in person?
So the first game I remember going to in person, I would go with my grandfather occasionally to Jerry Park. A couple of times a season we would go, probably when I was 6 or 7 years old. So circa 1970, 71 seasons.
Mhm.
So I remember those games in Jerry Park, very low key feel. And television was and also as a kid, I remember listening to the games primarily on the radio. They weren't on television all that often. Again, it was in an era before every game was televised anyway, and sort of like the pre-cable era as well. But they would be on television. There would be sort of a game of the week on the Canadian station. It was not CBC there, but it was CTV. They had a Wednesday night game of the week. So reliably, the course of the season, Wednesday nights they were on, and then the only other games that were on television in those early years when I was growing up in Montreal and a big fan was occasionally they'd be on like the game of the week, a nationally televised game on one of the US stations, which we got in Canada. We got the US networks. And that was a big deal, when they were on the game of the week. And then also there was Monday Night Baseball.
There was
And
Monday Night
occasionally they were on
Baseball,
Monday
was
Night Baseball.
Joe Garagiola. Yeah.
ABC had Monday Night Baseball.
And so did you have a favorite player in that era?
Well, I love Gary Carter. There was a guy who was a third baseman for the Expos for many years, a guy by the name of Larry Parrish,
I remember him. Yeah.
who I liked a lot. Andre Dawson, who was just, of course, an all-star and just was a many tool player.
Great all around defender, base
Yeah,
stealer, home run hitter.
yeah,
Yeah. Everything.
yeah. Probably one of the great all-around, or if not the greatest all-around player that the Expos had. There was a guy named Ellis Valentine who was a good outfielder for a number of years and had an incredible arm.
Mhm.
So I remember him. So those were among my favorites. There was all intermingled with those years where they were good contenders, and I was
Right.
very into the game. So it was all part of the mix in those
Yeah.
years.
It was a fun team. A lot of great
Yeah.
players on that team, and they did well. Yeah. So a couple of the things I know I wanted to talk with you about today. One is that I hear there was a time when you played Strat-O-Matic baseball.
Yes, I did. So I'll tell you how that got its start. There was a buddy of mine in high school named John Frankel who is also a friend of Andy's, and he still lives here in Boston. We part of a poker group once a month we do. But anyway, so John and I were big baseball fans at the time. We would go to games together, and we played a baseball board game that was not a predecessor necessarily to Strat-O-Matic, but it was an alternative to Strat-O-Matic. At the time, we did this for a couple of years. It was a game that was put out it was called Sports Illustrated Baseball. I don't know if you ever ran across it. Can't even remember how it was played. But that was sort of first got us into sort of the idea of baseball board games. We played Sports Illustrated Baseball, and that game was based less on current players. So I remember we played one season of Sports Illustrated Baseball with all these old players that sort of got us familiar with a whole generation of players that we didn't really know, like Honus Wagner and Stan Musial and Christy Mathewson and
Oh,
Babe
yeah.
Ruth and Tris Speaker. Those were all the players that we were playing with in Sports Illustrated Baseball. And then we somehow got turned on to Strat-O-Matic, and we started playing and we got into it. And then we decided I think it was actually summer of '82 that we decided we're going to try to play an entire sort of season of Strat-O-Matic and simulate a full season. And I'm not sure whether we did it with every single team. I think what we did was we constructed two divisions of 4 or 6 teams or something like that. But we played the equivalent of 162 games.
Oh my goodness.
I think so. We played well over 1,000 games of Strat-O-Matic that summer. We started in May when school sort of got out, and then it continued. We were both summer camp counselors at a sleepaway camp north of Montreal, and so we would play like in the evenings after the kids were asleep and like during rest hour.
rolling the dice, right?
Rolling the dice, and I remember there were a couple of times we were in the heat of an intense game, and you'd hear over the camp loudspeakers that rest hour was over, and we'd say, well, we're going to extend the rest hour for another 15 minutes so we can
finish the 8th inning here.
So we did this whole season, and I remember and then once a week we would do statistics, and we would sort of do all the numbers to see, whether the numbers in the game, the standings, but also what the player averages would, and see how well they sort of correlated with. So we played the season that we played with the 1980 baseball season.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I remember was that was the year that George Brett, I think, hit 390.
That's probably right. I know it was right around then. Yes. Yeah.
And in our season, George Brett hit around 390 in our simulated season. We had a Kansas City Royals team in our season, and so most of, not everything exactly, but things correlated pretty well over the course of our season. And even the team that won our season, it was the Dodgers or the Yankees, I can't remember. And as we were getting into this, so my friend John, who's a much handier person than I am, for this season, we built a little arts and craftsy sort of homemade stadium that we called Strat-O Stadium. And it had like a field like that we would roll the dice, a surface that we would roll the dice on, and in the back wall of Strat-O Stadium, the home run wall, we had little logos of each of the teams, these tiny little logos that lined the back wall.
My goodness. That's elaborate.
So no, this was like the real deal. Like we were really into this.
Yeah. But you didn't play all, let's see, back then there probably would have been maybe 24 teams, 26 teams. I'm not sure. But yeah, so you just played, like you said, 2 divisions of about a half a dozen teams.
Yeah, one maybe was American League and the other was National League. I can't remember exactly how we did it. Those are the details that are, and unfortunately, we kept. I wanted to keep Strat-O Stadium. It was a memento. We kept it for many, many years, and then once while I was away in college or something like that, my stepmother threw it out, much to our dismay. So we don't have any. I don't even have any photos of it, unfortunately. But it was this fun thing, and then another sort of fun little piece of trivia from that season, that Strat-O-Matic season that we did. So the camp had, as one of its activities, they had this little like local little radio station that was like that reached sort of around the campus of the camp, a little AM radio station. It was like an activity, like kids could do radio and broadcast stuff, and they could even broadcast stuff over the loudspeakers. And so John and I came up with this idea that we would have the Strat-O-Matic All-Star Game that summer, and we would broadcast it on the camp radio during rest hour one day. So we did. We actually put together this all-star game with with our teams, and we sort of played simulated a game. Then we did the play-by-play and the analysis on all of that over the camp radio station that the kids listened to and got a kick out of, I think.
Next up, George Brett representing the Kansas City Royals.
Yeah, no, like we got into it.
It's a base hit to left field.
I might have even like pre-recorded some like intro theme music like that the networks would use to introduce it. Like we did like a whole like production. It was
Wow.
hysterical. And we were like, I don't know, we were like 18-ish, 18,
Yeah.
19 at the time.
That's
Doing
a
this.
lot of fun. Yeah. So I was a Strat-O-Matic head as well. We had my brother and I and our neighbor next door would have been about the same era. I remember we usually you could buy sets of like the division winners plus your next two or three or whatever favorite teams, or you could like buy all the teams. And the one year we bought all the teams was for the 1979 season.
Ah,
We
okay.
had all, well, it wasn't 30. I'm not sure if it was 26, 28. I can't remember how many teams there were now, but we never attempted to play a full 162 games. I think we did something more like we tried to play a dozen games with each team or
Yeah.
something,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we did, and we kept the stats. And I think even in smaller data sets, we didn't play as many games, but I think it was pretty accurate. The
Yeah.
players did perform the way they did in real life.
Yeah, and I remember like you could do things like there was strategy to it. And yes, there was a bit of a luck dice thing too, but I remember like you could do a suicide squeeze. I mean,
Yep.
there were you could pull off as the manager many of the, strategic moves that are,
Yep.
you
And
know,
if you were holding the runner and you got a certain kind of ground ball A plus plus on the end of it, it would get through between the second baseman and the runner would advance to third base.
yeah, yeah,
Things like that.
yeah, yeah. Well, we had a lot of fun with it.
Well, that's good. That's fun to talk about that. And yeah, for anybody who's out there playing Strat-O-Matic now or thinking about it, it really is fun. You'd have to look and see how they play those games today. I'm sure they have some online and digital versions.
Yeah,
Back when we were playing, it was like printed out cards and you
yeah,
rolled dice. But I also think that's more fun because you got to hold the thing in your hand. It had the player's name, it had their statistics on it.
yeah.
Um,
And you really got to know the players and their statistics when you played.
Yeah. So the last thing I have on our topics list today is I wanted to talk a
Sure.
little bit about your website, greatruns.com.
Ah, okay.
Clearly, you're a runner. I am to some extent. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about how that got started. And
Sure. Yeah. So greatruns.com, it's sort of a hobby project. So as for my career, for my work over the years, I've been a long time consultant in the telecom industry, and I've traveled quite a bit for work, and also sort of at least for the last 30-35 years have been sort of your everyday casual runner, 4 or 5 miles, 5-6 miles a day. And I realized that as I was traveling around to different places that there was really no resource for runners when they would sort of get somewhere new. There was no real good resource on, where's the best place to go running when you land in, Detroit or Pittsburgh or London or wherever. You'd be sort of at the whim of where you were staying, and maybe a knowledgeable concierge, hit or miss. Maybe the hotel would have a running map. And I noticed, and there were resources for so many other sports, and there's fantastic books and websites and resources for great hiking trails or good places to go bike riding or fly fishing spots or best golf courses, all that stuff. And I realized there wasn't really a resource like this for running. So I started out about 15 years ago. I wrote 3 local guidebooks for the Boston area. One, the signature title was Great Runs in Boston. It did very well locally. And I wanted to sort of take the concept and expand it, but I realized that book model doesn't really scale. I mean, it's a hyper local sort of thing. And I also wanted to orient it more towards people who, like the Boston books were more oriented towards people who sort of live here. The idea was to sort of put together this resource for travelers. And so I started, around 2016 or so, this website called greatruns.com. And the idea was basically to provide the ultimate guide to the best places to run in destinations all over the world. We have now guides to pretty much anywhere you can think, like pretty much any major destination that people would travel to for work or for pleasure, and also, vacation destinations and so on. So we have, major cities, national parks, popular vacation destinations like Disney, and the idea is, any place, if you're a runner, any place you're traveling to, you want to try to find a place to go running. And the idea is to try to find, to advise people on the best places, the most interesting, scenic, memorable places to go running. So it won't be, if we have something for like Portland, Oregon, for example, it won't be every possible place you could go running. It'll be the, 10 or 15 or 20 best places. And we do a lot of research to make sure that any roads that we have people on, if it's not a dedicated path or trail, we're putting people on roads, that it's safe. So it's got a sidewalk or a shoulder. Again, we do a lot of research. So it might, a road on Google Maps might look like, hey, this looks like a really nice road along the water. Well, we make sure that the research that we do, that you can see the water, that it's not blocked by hotels or buildings and that sort of thing. So, and it's been a fun project. We get a lot of visitors to the site. I mean, if you do a search now on, best places to run in, like name your city, we show up pretty much near the top of the list almost all the time in the Google search results, which is sort of a nice accomplishment. And we get about 250,000 people a month who come to the site.
That's fabulous. Yeah, I was looking just the other day, and there was it's kind of a summary of best runs from 2022, and people had submitted photographs of themselves with runs all over the world. There were runs in Greenland and Germany and Australia and New Zealand, all over the place.
Yeah. That's something we did. It's the third year we've done it. I sort of started this idea called Run of the Year. So we have about 25,000 people who get our newsletter. And we sort of sent out a note to the people who get our newsletter, submit a photo and a little caption of the most interesting or memorable run that you did last year. And so some people will send a picture of a particularly beautiful spot, like a sunset run on a beach or something like that. Others, it was an accomplishment, like a photo of them completing their first marathon, as you saw from that slideshow. So what we do is they submit these photos and captions, and then we sort of take some of the best ones and we put together this slideshow that we just then sent out. So, and it was great because all over the world, all sorts of different experiences and accomplishments. It's really sort of one of those, labors of love. It's the only resource of its kind. I think the content is really good. I probably get 3 or 4 emails every week from people who just, use the site and find it very useful. And I've met some really interesting people online.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I've enjoyed looking through it and seeing, I really like getting the pictures of each person and then the little paragraph or so that they might write to, say why it mattered to them, why they were there. And I have other things on my list, but I mean, we've got plenty of content for an episode here.
Yeah. One thing I have to say, because your title of the podcast, My Week in Baseball, of course, does remind me of the fact that as a kid growing up and being into baseball, I was a regular viewer of This Week in Baseball.
Yeah, exactly.
That show with it was Mel Allen, who was
Mel Allen. Yeah, that's right.
And
welcome to This Week in Baseball.
And I remember something about the graininess of I think a lot of it was on film rather than video at the time. And so I just remember there was sort of just the way it was put together, and he had such a distinct voice.
He really did. And they'd always have the highlights. They'd have great catches of the week.
Yeah.
Who was the hot hitter, this week, Rod Carew led the league in hitting this week, batting an incredible 592. And
I think they had some blooper type things as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, one last little piece of trivia to share with you about the Expos, now that I'm remembering it, was growing up, most of the games I listened to on the radio rather than watch them on television. And the play-by-play announcers for most of the years that I was into it, the guy named Dave Van Horn, who was the play-by-play guy, but the analyst that he did it with was Duke Snider.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he was quite good.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, radio listening, and I still prefer radio listening. Last season I had, MLB TV, but I really don't like watching it. I prefer the MLB radio.
Yeah.
And just listening to the games, and there's no blackouts.
Really, baseball, if you think about it, is the only sport that translates well to the radio.
Yeah, the only other things I had looked up some players who had been both on the Tigers and the Expos.
And
the one that struck me the most, which would have been right at that kind of time period we're talking about, the late 70s, after the 1979 season, the Tigers traded center fielder Ron LaFleur to the Expos
Oh,
for left-handed pitcher Dan Schatzeder.
that's right. I remember the pitcher, Dan Schatzeder, and I remember Ron LaFleur. He was on the team for a while. Fielder, right? Right field?
Yeah, I think if for Detroit he had played center. I think they played
Okay.
him in left. The Expos played him
Okay.
in left.
He was like, my recollection of him, I could be totally wrong, was very up and down.
He was a great base stealer, and I think he stole in the 90s. There was that one year where there were three guys who stole right around 100 bases.
Yeah.
And yeah, he was one of them. I think he had a tendency to indulge after the game was over,
Ah,
and maybe wasn't the best clubhouse influence, showing up
that's
late
right.
for
There was
showing up
something about
late.
that name. It triggered in my mind. Yeah, he
Show up
was.
late for a game, maybe show up
Yeah,
not completely sober for a game.
yeah,
Things like that, I think, impeded his career.
yeah. Well, the guy who was like an incredible character from that, and not in the same category as LaFleur, but just an incredible character who also played some seasons for the Expos, was a guy by the name of Bill Lee.
Oh yes, Billy. Yeah, yeah.
So Bill Lee played, of course, for the Red Sox, I think,
Mm-hmm.
but he also
Yep.
played for the Expos
The
for a few years.
spaceman, the
The
spaceman. He was
spaceman.
always a little out there, wasn't he?
He was a character, but I think I think he has continued to play professional baseball for many, many years. I think he's still got some affiliation with the game today, like in Vermont or something like that. And every once in a while, I'll see a story about Bill Lee.
That would be, let's see, pretty good career record: 119 wins, 90 losses, 3.62 ERA.
Yeah.
For Montreal, 1979, he was 16-10, 3.04 ERA.
So, what do you think about this season for baseball? It's going to be very interesting to see how it works with all these changes and the pitch clock, which I'm personally in favor of.
I wonder how it's going to work with all these changes happening at once.
Mm.
The bigger bases, the pitch clock, the no shifting.
It is a lot of change.
I think it's a lot of change at once. And I know they're saying it sped up the games in the minor leagues.
Yeah.
But when I read that, it is never clear to me that the minor leagues were doing all these things at the same time. I think they were doing the pitch clock. I don't think they had bigger bases. I don't think they were doing the no shift. I'm not sure if the point is to speed up the game. I think they're also doing things at the same time that will slow the game down, because if you've got bigger bases, you're going to get more base hits. You're going to have more stolen bases. You're going to have longer innings. So you might have less time between the pitches, but there will be more runs scored, which will be more exciting. There'll be more stolen bases, which will be more exciting. But I wonder if it will really shorten the game.
Yeah, I think they're trying to do two things at once, and they might run counter to each other, right? Increase the pace of play, and also just bring a little bit more athleticism into the game, a little bit just more plays, more balls in play, more things going on in the base paths, and we'll see. I mean, it'll be super interesting. Probably the biggest year of change in the game. So I was going to ask you, if you sounds like you've had the opportunity to travel around and see some different stadiums. Do you have a few favorites among the stadiums that you've been to?
I do actually like T-Mobile Park, which is the current name of the park in Seattle. I think that's pretty nice. The old Tiger Stadium, I have great memories of being there, but it was horrible. Yeah. It was horrible for sitting there as a fan. Now, I like the way the right field corner hung over, and you could hit a home run off the facing of a deck. And a couple of people hit balls. Reggie Jackson once, Cecil Fielder once hit balls over the roof, which was almost impossible to do. Happened a handful of times. But it wasn't really a very nice stadium. There were a lot of obstructed views. It was really old and kind of run down. The concessions areas were lousy. The new Comerica Park in Detroit, I like pretty well. Seems like when I'm on Twitter and people complain about it, but I don't. I've always kind of liked it. I think it doesn't have much protected area. So if you're there in a hot, sunny summer day, you are out in the hot sun. There's not an overhang. I like Fenway. I've been to Fenway several times.
Yeah,
It's a classic park, and it's just so unique in its shape.
it is.
Um,
There are a lot of crappy seats, but it's still a fun place to be for a ball
yeah,
game.
yeah. I went to one game in Olympic Stadium, and I just
Oh, you
remember it
did?
being. I remember it being huge. I don't remember who they
Cavernous.
played. I don't remember who won, but
Yeah.
it was enormous. And wherever we sat, we were so far away from the
Yeah,
field.
yeah. Even the
Um,
good seats were like far from the game.
yeah.
There's, yeah, you didn't have that sense of intimacy at all.
And where else have I been? I mean, the old Kingdom. The old Kingdom was lousy. It was really
Yeah.
a horribly ugly park, and I'm glad that's gone. Been to the old Comiskey and the new Comiskey in Chicago. Uh, the old Comiskey had some personality. Had these huge stone brick arches,
Hmm.
and we saw a no hitter there. So Jack Morris pitched a no hitter against the White Sox in 1984.
That's cool.
The new Comiskey is also really big and has, if you're in the outfield, it has really steep seats.
Hmm.
Um, didn't like that as well. I guess probably my favorite right now is probably T-Mobile in Seattle.
Mhm.
And I'm going down to Oakland soon. I'm going to go down for opening day to the
Oh,
Coliseum.
they're still playing in Memorial Coliseum, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
It's
like a
got a
relic. It's one of the
slightly
few that
different name.
survives from
Yeah,
that whole era.
yeah. It's still there. This might I can't remember if the lease is up this year or next year, but they're having the city council in Alameda County, or the county council, is not moving very quickly. And
Oh.
Rob Mansfeld is getting kind of concerned. So I wouldn't be completely surprised if the Oakland A's become the Las Vegas A's.
Right. Yeah, no, I've read that too, that it could happen. And, Oakland's got so many other things they're dealing with that I'm not sure that there's the appetite for the cost of a new stadium, at least funded by taxpayers.
Yeah, yeah.
So we'll see.
Um,
The stadium in if you're in Oakland in that neighborhood, it's worth trying to get to the San Francisco Stadium.
oh, the Giants. Yeah, yeah. I think
Yeah,
it
what
might
it's
be
even
called
called now.
Petco. I can't remember now.
The
They
one
changed.
right downtown San Francisco.
Right.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, they're not home though. That's in fact we're going.
Uh
My daughter's a baseball fan too, so we're going together. She has a few
oh,
days
fun.
off between classes, so we're going specifically for opening day. And I actually checked to see if we could catch a game in San Francisco as well, but they're away for the first week or 10 days.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah. How
Another
about you?
time.
How about you? Favorite stadium?
I really enjoy Camden Yards, Baltimore.
Oh, I have been there. Yes, I forgot about that.
Wrigley, of course, is fantastic. Just it's a unique experience. The one in San Francisco. I was at not the newer one in Atlanta, but the older one, which I didn't like at all, actually. Like the new, not the one because also Atlanta they were played in Fulton County Stadium for a number of years. Then they built a new stadium.
Right,
Then they
Turner
built another
Field.
new stadium. They're
Yeah.
on their second new stadium. National Stadium I like quite a bit.
Hmm.
One in DC.
Hmm.
Yeah, so those are some of the good ones. Yeah, I had this idea to fuse my two interests. You'll appreciate this because you're a runner. If I could put together a tour like in the Northeast, so this is the ultimate trip. You sort of pull together a bunch of people who like to run and like baseball, and you organize it so you go to some of these cities that are sort of close to each other. So you go to a city, you do a run during the day, you go to a ball game at night, and then you sort of hop on the train and go to the next city, and you could sort of do it from like the Boston to DC corridor if you could plan it when there's enough home games. And it was a logistical challenge, but I thought that would be a sort of a cool thing to do.
And now our Blimerick, a tribute to the Montreal Expos. Carter, Dawson, Cromartie, and Parrish, the Expos had stars, none of them garish. The World Series not to be till they went to Washington, D.C. to win as the Nationals, a season to cherish.
But
Okay.
this was lots of fun. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure having you on the show today. Thanks so much. We'll
All
talk to
right.
you again.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So that's all for today, my friends. Join us next time because honestly, what can be better than talking baseball? I'm your host, Phil Estruth Harrison. We'll see you next time on My Week in Baseball.